Marcus moved through the darkened corridors on floor 39 with the silence of smoke. The fire extinguisher balanced in his right hand, familiar weight distributed for quick deployment. Red emergency lights painted everything in hellish tones, shadows stretching and contracting as he passed through their pools of illumination. The first two mercenaries emerged from a supply closet, systematic in their search pattern. They'd split up, cardinal mistake in close quarters. Marcus waited until the gap between them widened to 15 feet, then struck. The first man went down before his brain registered the attack. Fire extinguisher to the temple with precisely calibrated force. Not enough to kill, sufficient to guarantee unconsciousness for hours. The second mercenary turned at the sound, hand reaching for his sidearm, but Marcus was already inside his reaction loop. Elbow to throat collapsed the windpipe partially. Knee to solar plexus folded him. The man hit the floor gasping like a landed fish. Marcus took their radios, fitting one earpiece carefully. The chatter told him everything he needed to know. The voices carried professional calm, military cadence underlying civilian words. At least 8 hostiles, probably more. They knew Emma was here. They were hunting for her specifically. Every cell in Marcus's body screamed to run back to the panic room, put himself between Emma and everything. But that meant defensive posture, reactive thinking. The only way to protect her was to make them react to him instead. Victoria's fingers flew across her keyboard in the office 42 floors above. Emma slept fitfully in the panic room. Rabbit clutched tight. Victoria's hands shook slightly as she typed. Muscle memory fighting against adrenaline and the ghosts of basements from 20 years ago. She forced herself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale and exhale like the therapist had taught her after the kidnapping. Fear was information. Panic was surrender. She chose information. The security system had been compromised through sophisticated backdoor access, the kind that required either extensive inside knowledge or months of patient infiltration. Victoria suspected both, but this was her building, her system, built on architecture she'd personally approved. She knew backdoors the installers had forgotten about, redundancies nobody had documented because she'd insisted on them after the official specs were filed. Her fingers found purchase in subsystems the hackers hadn't thought to lock. Emergency lighting came back online on floors 35 through 42. Not full illumination, but enough to eliminate the mercenaries' night vision advantage. The radio Marcus carried crackled with confusion. Victoria's smile held no warmth. She restored camera feeds next, watching screens populate with grainy footage. Marcus appeared on floor 37, moving through a stairwell with fluid economy. 2 more mercenaries lay unconscious in his wake. Victoria keyed into the building's ancient intercom system, manually routing communications. Her voice reached Marcus through the radio he'd taken. Marcus's response came clipped and professional. Victoria's fingers found the building management system, pulling up floor plans and access controls. Stairwell B showed on her screen with 2 heat signatures trapped between floors. 30 seconds of coding later, electromagnetic locks engaged. The mercenaries were sealed in place, imprisoned by their own ambition. Marcus's voice carried something that might have been approval. Victoria allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before diving back into the systems, looking for any advantage she could manufacture from electrons and code. Floor 37's stairwell reeked of concrete and old metal. 3 mercenaries came through the door in tactical formation, weapons drawn but held low to avoid friendly fire in tight confines. They'd learned from their fallen comrades, moving with heightened caution. The narrow space became an advantage for Marcus. They couldn't surround him, couldn't bring numbers to bear. Single file through the doorway meant single combat multiplied by 3. The first rushed when patience cracked. Marcus sidestepped, using the man's momentum against him, sending him tumbling down half a flight of stairs. Bones cracked on impact. The mercenary didn't get up. The second pulled a knife, professional grade with serrated spine. He came in low and fast, trained technique showing in every movement. Marcus caught the wrist mid-thrust, felt the strength in the man's arm, recognized training that matched his own. They grappled, knife point wavering between them. Marcus slammed the captured wrist against the metal railing repeatedly until fingers opened and the blade clattered away. But the mercenary wasn't finished. He drove a headbutt that caught Marcus above the eye, splitting skin and painting vision red on one side. They traded blows in the confined space, brutal efficiency without grace or mercy. Marcus's ribs took damage, pain flowering with each breath. The mercenary's nose shattered under Marcus's palm strike. It ended when Marcus got leverage, sweeping legs and controlling the descent. The mercenary's head met concrete with a sound like a hammer on meat. He stopped moving. The third mercenary held back, smarter than his companions. When Marcus turned toward him, blood running down his face and breathing labored, the man raised his weapon. Victoria's voice crackled through Marcus's earpiece just as water exploded from fire suppression nozzles overhead. The mercenary flinched, looking up reflexively. Marcus closed the distance before training could override surprise. 3 brutal strikes, and the man joined his unconscious colleagues. Marcus leaned against the wall, cataloging damage. Ribs definitely bruised, possibly cracked. Cut above the eye wouldn't stop bleeding. Knuckles split open again. But Emma was still safe. Victoria was still safe. Pain was temporary. That made it acceptable. The radio crackled with a new voice, educated and cold, carrying authority that made the other mercenaries sound like hired help. Marcus felt ice crystallize in his spine. That voice belonged to a ghost from 20 years ago, Daniel Cross himself. Victoria patched the intercom through to her office speakers. She needed to hear this, needed to understand what they faced. Cross's voice filled the space, calm and terrible. Floor 41's conference room held Cross flanked by 2 personal bodyguards. He'd eschewed tactical gear for an expensive suit, as if this were a business negotiation rather than an assault. The gun in his hand looked almost decorative, an accessory rather than a weapon. But Marcus knew better. Men like Cross didn't carry guns for show. Cross continued through the intercom, his voice taking on edges that cut deeper than any blade. Marcus stopped moving, every muscle tensing. The words landed like physical blows. Victoria's hands froze on her keyboard. Emma stirred in the panic room, frowning in her sleep as if sensing distress through walls and distance. Cross's voice broke slightly, 20 years of control fracturing around genuine grief. The image formed with terrible clarity. An 18-year-old kid, computer engineering student, tech support for his father's operation because college was expensive and family helped family. When Marcus's team breached the compound, Alex Cross had been running diagnostics on security systems, trapped in a room that became a coffin when the building came down. Nobody came for him because nobody knew he existed. Intel had said no civilians. Intel had been wrong, or incomplete, or deliberately sanitized to make the mission easier to execute. Marcus closed his eyes, seeing fire and collapsed walls and the kind of devastation that followed violent action. How many bodies had they pulled from that rubble? How many had they left behind because extraction was complete and clock was ticking? Victoria sat frozen, tears streaming down her face. A boy had died so she could live. That calculus was supposed to feel justified, necessary, the hard mathematics of hostage rescue. But hearing about him as a person, with dreams and a girlfriend and plans for Japan, made those equations feel like lies. Cross's final words carried promise and threat in equal measure. Marcus forced himself to move, climbing stairs toward the top floor. Every step hurt. Breathing hurt. Existing hurt. But Emma was up there, and pain was just information the body sent to the brain. Information could be acknowledged and then ignored. The hallway outside Victoria's office stretched empty and too quiet. 3 mercenaries waited at the door like professional pallbearers. Behind them stood Daniel Cross, silver-haired and distinguished, looking like he belonged in boardrooms rather than war zones. The gun in his hand pointed steadily at Marcus. Cross's offer sounded reasonable, almost gentle. Marcus studied the odds. 3 armed mercenaries plus Cross, himself injured and exhausted, armed with nothing but bloodied hands and exhausted will. The smart play was surrender, buy time, wait for FBI. The smart play left Emma and Victoria vulnerable to a man whose voice promised death regardless of cooperation. Marcus met Cross's eyes, seeing grief there underneath rage, understanding the dimensions of pain that could drive someone to this, understanding it and rejecting it completely. Cross's laugh carried genuine amusement. Inside the office, Victoria made decisions that terrified and empowered her in equal measure. She couldn't sit and wait while Marcus faced impossible odds. She had resources he didn't. The building itself was her weapon. Her fingers entered commands rapidly, pulling up emergency protocols most people didn't know existed. Protocol 7 was designed for fires, for chemical spills, for catastrophic failures that required immediate containment. She adapted it for different catastrophe. Victoria crossed to the panic room, Emma still sleeping inside, peaceful in ways the adult world no longer allowed. She knelt beside the makeshift bed, brushing hair from Emma's forehead. Emma's sleepy confusion cut through Victoria's heart. The truth assembled itself in stark relief. She loved this child. Somewhere between hot chocolate and butterfly drawings and brave questions, Emma had stopped being a mission or obligation and become simply loved. The kiss felt like benediction and farewell in equal measure. Victoria armed herself with fire extinguisher and letter opener and heels that could be weapons if necessary. More importantly, she carried her phone with building controls at her fingertips. 20 years ago, someone came for her in darkness. Tonight, she refused to be the person who waited for rescue. The hallway erupted in chaos as fire suppression activated with violence. Water exploded from ceiling nozzles, drenching everything instantly. Emergency alarms shrieked, lights strobed, visibility collapsed to fragmented impressions through curtains of cascading water. Marcus moved before the mercenaries could adjust. The nearest man took a tackle that sent both of them sliding across wet marble. Marcus got mount position, drove elbows down until resistance ceased. The second mercenary fired. The bullet grazed Marcus's shoulder, burning a line of agony that barely registered against existing injuries. Marcus kept moving, closing distance, getting inside the gun's effective range. They fought for control of the weapon, hands slipping on wet metal, water blinding them both. The gun discharged between them. The mercenary's eyes went wide with surprise and pain. He collapsed, taking the weapon with him. Cross fired at Marcus from across the hallway. Victoria's office door slammed open, fire extinguisher sailing through the air in a perfect arc. It caught Cross's arm, destroying his aim. The shot went wild, punching through ceiling tiles. The third mercenary grabbed Marcus from behind, chokehold professionally applied, cutting off blood flow to brain. Vision narrowed to tunnels edged with black. Marcus had seconds before unconsciousness. He drove his head backward with everything remaining. Felt the mercenary's nose explode. Felt the grip loosen fractionally. Enough. Marcus spun, sidekick to the knee, heard it break, watched the man collapse screaming. Cross retrieved his fallen pistol, water streaming down his face, making him look older and more desperate. He aimed at Marcus, finger tightening on trigger. Emma's voice cut through the case, high and terrified. She disobeyed orders, left the panic room, stood in the office doorway taking in the violence and blood, and her father on his knees in water turned pink. Cross's aim shifted toward the voice, toward the easier target, toward the leverage that had been his goal from the beginning. Marcus threw himself forward with the last reserves of strength and will. The gun fired. The bullet meant for Emma punched into Marcus's chest, high on the right side, missing heart but finding lung. He went down hard, water soaking through his clothes, mixing with blood that pumped out with each struggling heartbeat. The ceiling spun above him, Victoria's face appearing in his narrowing vision, her hands pressing against the wound, but pressure wasn't enough when bullets punctured things that needed to stay sealed. Emma's scream followed him down into darkness that had teeth. Victoria grabbed the fallen fire extinguisher, cross-turning back toward Marcus to finish what he'd started. She swung with every ounce of strength and fear and protective fury that had been building since this started. The impact drove Cross forward, blood streaming from his scalp. But 20 years of obsession had given him endurance against pain. He turned, gun rising toward Victoria, death in his eyes. Marcus forced his body to obey, despite lungs that wouldn't inflate properly, despite blood loss that made his limbs feel distant and unresponsive. He lunged, caught Cross around the waist, momentum carrying them both toward the shattered window. They crashed through together, glass exploding outward, rain and wind, and 42 floors of empty air beneath them. Marcus's hand found the fire escape railing, fingers wrapping with desperate strength even as Cross's weight tried to pull him down. His other arm held Cross's jacket collar, the fabric cutting into his grip. They hung there, suspended between building and oblivion, rain hammering down and making everything slick. Marcus's grip began failing, fingers opening incrementally despite commands from a brain that knew releasing Cross meant falling with him. Victoria leaned through the broken window, reaching desperately, unable to bridge the final inches. Emma appeared beside her, small face white with terror. Cross's voice carried defeat and exhaustion that transcended physical circumstances. Marcus's arms shook with the strain of holding them both, blood making everything slippery. Each breath a fight against lungs that didn't work right anymore. 20 years of rage looked up at Marcus from Cross's eyes, and beneath that rage, the face of a father who'd lost everything and spent 2 decades in pursuit of vengeance that couldn't bring his son back. Marcus's response came from somewhere deep and truthful, the place where certainty lived. Becoming a monster to avenge loss didn't honor the lost. It betrayed them by transforming their memory into fuel for atrocity. Something shifted in Cross's expression, some calculation resolving itself into acceptance or surrender or simply exhaustion with carrying hate for so long. The words came quiet, almost lost in rain and wind. Then Cross's hands opened, releasing Marcus's jacket, making the choice himself rather than forcing Marcus to make it for him. Marcus tried to hold on, fingers tightening reflexively, but blood and rain had made purchase impossible. Cross fell through 42 floors of darkness, disappearing into rain and shadows. The impact when it came was too distant to hear over wind and alarms and Emma's screaming. Victoria's hands locked around Marcus's wrist, grip stronger than seemed possible for someone who'd spent her life behind desks and in boardrooms. Emma grabbed too, tiny hands adding negligible physical assistance, but psychological weight that made giving up impossible. They hauled Marcus back through the broken window inch by inch, glass cutting all of them, muscles screaming with the effort. He collapsed on the office floor in a spreading pool of water and blood, Emma throwing herself across him, rabbit falling forgotten, her face buried against his chest. The wound bubbled with each attempted breath, pink foam indicating punctured lung, bad but survivable if help arrived fast. Marcus touched Emma's face with bloodied fingers, feeling her tears mix with rain and red. The promise felt like lifting a mountain, but he'd made it and meant it and would keep it or die trying. His eyes closed despite his best efforts to keep them open. Emma's face disappeared into darkness, shot through with colored lights that had no source. Sirens finally arrived 3 minutes after Marcus lost consciousness. Police first, then FBI, then ambulances screaming up to the building's entrance, with lights painting the wet pavement in rotating urgency. Paramedics took the stairs because the elevators were still locked down, arriving on floor 42, with equipment and expertise in the controlled urgency of people who dealt with catastrophe professionally. They stabilized Marcus enough for transport, chest tube installed to reinflate the collapsed lung, IV lines feeding fluids to compensate for blood loss. Emma refused to let go of his hand during the entire process. Small fingers wrapped around his despite paramedics trying to work around her. Nobody forced her to release him. Some things mattered more than procedure. Victoria rode in her own car, following the ambulance through streets that parted for emergency vehicles. She'd refused treatment for the cuts on her hands and face. Refused everything until she knew Marcus would survive. Her dress was ruined, torn and bloodstained, and soaked through. She looked like she'd survived a war. She felt like she had. St. Mary's Hospital received them with practiced efficiency. Marcus disappeared into surgery within minutes, trauma team already assembled and waiting. Emma tried to follow, but nurses intercepted gently, redirecting her to the waiting room where Victoria gathered her up and held her while she cried. Senator James Ashford arrived 40 minutes later, gray hair disheveled and face creased with worry that vanished into relief when he saw Victoria. His hug lasted long enough to communicate everything words couldn't convey. When he released her, his eyes found Emma. Victoria made introductions. The senator knelt to Emma's level with the practiced ease of someone who'd raised a daughter and understood the importance of meeting children where they were. They sat together in hard plastic chairs designed to be uncomfortable enough to discourage loitering. Emma fell asleep eventually, exhaustion overcoming fear, head in Victoria's lap. The senator brought coffee nobody drank and spoke in quiet tones about things that didn't matter, filling silence to make it bearable. At 4:30 in the morning, a surgeon emerged still in scrubs, mask pulled down and exhaustion evident. Victoria stood so quickly Emma nearly fell before Victoria caught her. The explanation involved technical terminology about bullet trajectory, in tissue damage and surgical repair. But the core message was simple. Marcus would live. Recovery would be long, painful, require physical therapy and patience. But he would live. Emma burst into tears, good ones this time, relief pouring out in great shaking sobs. Victoria held her and cried too, makeup running and not caring, grief and fear and joy mixing into something too big for composure. They let them into intensive care 20 minutes later. Marcus lay surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed and monitored everything happening inside his battered body. Tubes ran to veins and wounds, oxygen supplemented through a nasal cannula. He looked pale and smaller somehow, diminished by injury and intervention. Emma climbed into the bed despite rules against it, careful of tubes and wires, pressing against his side like she could will him into waking through proximity alone. His eyes opened slowly, gray meeting gray across the small space between them. The exchange carried weight beyond its simplicity. Emma's desperate relief, Marcus's exhaustion and pain and satisfaction that she was safe, that his promise had been kept regardless of cost. Victoria stood at the foot of the bed, watching father and daughter, feeling something shift permanently inside herself. Whatever had been building between them over these past days solidified into certainty. This was her family now, not through blood or law yet, but through choice and crisis and the kind of bonds that formed when people survived impossible things together. FBI agents came on day 3 with offers wrapped in duty and patriotism. Return to service, full reinstatement, better pay and benefits, and the satisfaction of serving something larger than himself. Marcus listened with the politeness of someone who'd already made up his mind, but respected the effort. His refusal carried finality that discouraged argument. Emma needed a father who came home, not a ghost who disappeared into classified operations and returned in pieces if he returned at all. He'd spent 7 years being a weapon. He was done with that life permanently. The agents accepted his decision and left without pushing. Some things you couldn't argue someone into. Victoria came on day 7, the day Marcus was discharged. She'd arranged everything while he recovered. Transportation, discharge paperwork. The offer she'd refined over sleepless nights into something she hoped he couldn't refuse. The proposal came detailed and generous. Head of security for Ashford Industries. Salary that would transform their lives. Apartment in a building where heat worked and elevators functioned, and Emma could have her own room. Most importantly, hours that acknowledged he had a daughter who deserved a father present for breakfast and homework and bedtime stories. Marcus's objection came from pride, from years of taking by care of himself and Emma through grit and determination. Victoria met it directly. The real offer came softer, more personal, carrying vulnerability she rarely showed. Marcus looked at Emma, who'd overheard everything and whose face held hope so bright it hurt to witness. The conditions were minimal, reasonable, protecting what mattered most. Victoria agreed without hesitation. Emma launched herself at both of them, hugging with 7-year-old enthusiasm that acknowledged no boundaries of appropriate behavior. The apartment occupied the 15th floor of a building that had been renovated this decade. 2 bedrooms with actual doors that closed. Kitchen with appliances that matched. Bathroom with water pressure and no mold. Windows that sealed properly and walls that held heat. Emma ran through the rooms like they were Disneyland, voice echoing off walls that didn't absorb sound with water damage and decay. Marcus stood in the living room feeling disoriented by space and cleanliness and the simple fact of carpet that didn't smell like mildew. Victoria had furnished Emma's room personally, picking colors and bedding and books with care that suggested she'd enjoyed the process. The stuffed rabbit sat on the bed, professionally cleaned and repaired, one ear finally stitched permanently. A note attached read simply, "Every brave girl needs her rabbit." Emma found it and cried and hugged Victoria hard enough to leave wrinkles in expensive fabric. Victoria hugged back just as hard, not caring about wrinkles or makeup or the professional distance she usually maintained. This was family. Family operated on different rules. Later, after Emma exhausted herself exploring and fell asleep in her new bed, surrounded by new pillows, Marcus and Victoria stood on the small balcony, watching the city below. Traffic sounds drifted up, muted by distance and height. Lights painted patterns against darkness. Marcus's confession carried vulnerability he rarely showed. Victoria moved closer, their shoulders touching, warmth transferring through fabric and skin. Her response came from hard-won wisdom, from someone who'd survived her own kind of hell and learned that survival alone wasn't enough. Living meant taking risks, trusting people, building something worth protecting. The question hung between them, invitation and request, and the opening to something that had been building since that first morning in his apartment when she'd arrived with a motorcade in desperation. Marcus thought about Sarah, about promises made and kept, and the ones that had to evolve because circumstances changed. He thought Sarah would have liked Victoria, would have approved of someone strong enough to protect what mattered and brave enough to try. His answer was simple and true. Victoria smiled, something loosening in her posture, walls coming down brick by brick. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but filled with possibility. Marcus had a job that mattered and paid fairly. Emma had a home and stability, and two adults who loved her fiercely. Victoria had something she'd thought lost 20 years ago in that basement. She had family. She had home. She had people who saw past the CEO armor to the woman underneath and loved her anyway. The city sprawled below them, millions of stories unfolding simultaneously, most of them invisible from this height. But their story felt visible suddenly, significant, worth protecting and building and investing in with everything they had. Marcus thought about the men he'd been, the operator, the janitor, the survivor. Now he was simply himself, Marcus Sullivan, father and protector, and maybe something more if he let himself believe it was possible. Emma slept in her new room, surrounded by safety and comfort. Victoria stood close enough that Marcus could feel her breathing, steady and alive. Below them, the city hummed with possibility. For the first time in 7 years, Marcus let himself imagine a future that extended beyond tomorrow. The rain hammered against the glass corridors of Ashford Industries Tower long after midnight. Marcus Sullivan pushed his janitor's cart down the empty hallway on the 42nd floor, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like dying insects. His 7-year-old daughter Emma sat on a bench near the elevator, swinging her legs and clutching her worn stuffed rabbit, the one with the missing eye and the ear stitched back on 3 times. She'd brought a book tonight, something about butterflies, but her eyes kept drooping. Marcus had learned to make himself invisible over the past 7 years. At 36, he stood 6'2" with shoulders that came from years of discipline rather than gym memberships. His dark brown hair was cut military short, though nobody at Ashford Corporation knew why. His hands, calloused from pushing mops and hauling trash bags, bore faint scars that spoke of a different life. Those scars told stories he never shared, not even with Emma when she asked about the one across his knuckles or the puckered mark on his forearm. 3 men stepped out from the stairwell shadows. They moved with purpose toward the little girl. Not the wandering pace of lost employees or the casual stride of security making rounds. This was predatory motion, calculated and efficient. Their eyes locked on Emma with professional focus. The first scream shattered the silence. Emma's book clattered to the marble floor. Her legs stopped swinging. The stuffed rabbit tumbled from her grip as her body went rigid with the kind of primal fear that bypasses thought and strikes directly at the brainstem. Marcus turned. Instinct replaced thought. 6 seconds. That's all it took. The mop cart clattered aside, forgotten. His body remembered what his mind had tried to bury for 7 years. The first attacker barely registered Marcus's presence before an elbow strike caught him precisely in the throat. Not enough force to kill, but calculated to collapse the windpipe just enough to incapacitate completely. The man went down gasping, hands clutching at his neck, eyes wide with the sudden terror of drowning on dry land. The second attacker threw a punch that would have shattered an ordinary man's jaw. Marcus slipped it, feeling the displacement of air against his cheek, and redirected the momentum with a subtle twist of his torso. His fist drove into the man's solar plexus with surgical precision. The attacker folded like a broken accordion, all the air evacuating his lungs in one explosive wheeze. The third man pulled a knife. Big mistake. Marcus caught the wrist mid-thrust, twisted until something popped with a sound like breaking kindling, and swept the man's legs out from under him. The attacker's head connected with the polished marble floor, the impact echoing through the empty corridor like a gunshot. His body went limp immediately. 6 seconds. 3 men. Done. Emma stood frozen, her blue eyes wide with shock, her small frame trembling. Then she ran, not away from the violence but toward her father, crashing into his arms with enough force to make him stagger. She buried her face in his janitor's uniform, her small body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep and terrified. Marcus held her, his heart hammering against his ribs hard enough to hurt. One hand cradled the back of her head while the other pressed her close, as if he could somehow absorb her fear through sheer proximity. The words came automatically, the same ones he'd used when she woke from nightmares about the mother she'd never really known. But this time they felt hollow, inadequate against the reality of what had just happened. The security camera in the corner blinked its red eye, recording everything. Marcus looked at the three unconscious men scattered across the floor. Their equipment told a story he didn't want to read. Military-grade communication devices, coordinated tactical clothing under civilian jackets, the kind of stance and positioning that came from professional training, not street fighting. Someone had sent them. Someone with resources and planning, and worse, someone had sent them to a place where his daughter was. He pulled Emma close and moved fast, navigating through the blind spots he'd memorized over 7 years of cleaning these halls. The stairwell with the broken lock, the service corridor where the camera had been dark for 3 months because maintenance kept forgetting to replace it. By the time security arrived to find 3 confused men with no explanation, the janitor would be a ghost. That night, Marcus didn't sleep. He sat in their tiny apartment, watching the street below through torn curtains that did little to keep out the cold draft. The building was 4 floors up, no elevator, in a neighborhood where rust stains ran down the sides of buildings and laundry hung on fire escapes regardless of the weather. Their unit had one room that served as bedroom, living room, and dining room, plus a bathroom so small you had to step into the shower to close the door. Emma slept fitfully on the mattress they shared, crying out twice in the darkness. Both times Marcus was there instantly, his hand finding hers in the dark, his voice low and steady, even though his own pulse hammered with residual adrenaline and something darker that felt like rage wrapped in ice. He thought about Sarah. Always Sarah when Emma cried. His wife had made him promise. That last coherent moment before the complications during childbirth spiraled into catastrophe. One more mission, Marcus. Just one more, then you're done. Come home to us. We'll figure out the rest together. She died before he could keep that promise, before he could tell her he'd already put in his resignation, before he could say the words that mattered. The doctors had used clinical terms: hemorrhage, cardiac arrest, complications. Marcus had only heard one truth through the medical jargon and the sympathetic faces and the antiseptic smell of the hospital. His wife was gone and he was holding a newborn who needed him more than any mission ever had. So he disappeared. Not from Emma, but from the world that knew him as an operator. He became a janitor at Ashford Industries, one of those glass monuments to wealth and power that dominated the city's skyline. The pay was terrible. The hours were long, but it let him stay close to his daughter. He worked nights while she slept in the employee lounge or did homework under the glow of vending machines, and during the day he was simply her father. Morning came with the smell of burnt pancakes. Emma sat at their small kitchen table, legs swinging beneath her chair, watching Marcus scrape blackened batter off the pan with a metal spatula that had seen better decades. Her voice carried that particular 7-year-old blend of honesty and tact that made him smile despite everything. Marcus slid the least burned pancake onto her plate and watched her drown it in syrup with the intensity of a scientist conducting an important experiment. The normalcy felt fragile, like glass stretched too thin. He wanted to preserve this moment, seal it away somewhere safe. Emma giggling at burnt pancakes, morning light struggling through their dirty windows, the simple ritual of breakfast before school. But the memory of those 3 men wouldn't leave. Professional mercenaries didn't just stumble onto random janitors' daughters. Someone had sent them with specific intent. Someone who knew where Emma would be. Someone who would try again. The sirens started at 9, not police sirens with their familiar wail, but something else. Something that made the hair on the back of Marcus's neck stand up. He pulled back the curtain an inch and looked down at their street. 5 black SUVs with government plates blocked both ends of the road. Men in tactical vests were establishing a perimeter with the kind of efficiency that spoke of military training and federal resources. Neighbors poured onto their stoops, phones already out, capturing footage of something that didn't belong in this part of the city. From the armored Cadillac in the center of the formation, a woman emerged. Victoria Ashford wore a red dress with a V-neck cut, her blonde hair pulled back in a style that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent. Designer sunglasses hid her eyes, but her posture radiated the kind of authority that came from boardrooms and balance sheets. Two men in dark suits flanked her, their eyes constantly scanning, hands hovering near concealed weapons. A CEO didn't visit the poor side of town with a government escort unless something seismic was happening. Emma's voice pulled Marcus back from the window. He looked at his daughter, syrup on her chin, innocence in her eyes, and felt the weight of decisions he'd thought he'd left behind 7 years ago pressing down on his shoulders. Victoria Ashford climbed 4 flights of stairs in heels that clicked against worn treads, past peeling paint and flickering hallway lights that hummed with electrical problems the landlord would never fix. Her presence in this building felt like a rupture in reality, as if someone had photoshopped a fashion magazine cover onto a documentary about poverty. The knock came steady and professional, unavoidable in its certainty. Marcus put a finger to his lips, a gesture Emma understood immediately. She pressed herself against the wall near the bathroom door, clutching her stuffed rabbit tight enough to make her knuckles white. Victoria stood in the hallway, her heels sinking slightly into carpet that hadn't been replaced since the 80s. Up close, without the distance of corporate hierarchy, Marcus could see she was younger than he'd initially thought. Mid-30s maybe. And beneath the CEO armor, beneath the designer clothes and the professional mask, he recognized something familiar. Fear. The kind you learn to hide but never quite eliminated. Her voice carried the controlled precision of someone used to being obeyed. Marcus stepped aside, his body angling to keep himself between Emma and this woman who'd brought federal agents to their doorstep. Victoria removed her sunglasses as she entered. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, taking in everything about the apartment in seconds. The worn furniture, the patched walls, the single hot plate that served as their stove. Emma peeked out from behind Marcus, and for just a moment, Victoria's expression softened before the mask returned. Marcus kept his tone neutral, giving nothing away. Victoria sat on their worn couch, looking strange and out of place among their thrift store furniture. Her security stayed in the hallway. When the door closed, she spoke with the directness of someone who valued efficiency over pleasantries. Marcus studied her. Really studied her. She saw the military posture he couldn't fully hide, the way his eyes had tracked her security detail outside, the scars on his knuckles, the calm that radiated from someone who'd been in worse situations and survived them. Victoria showed him footage on her phone. 3 faces filled the screen, men Marcus had seen unconscious on marble floors just hours ago. She watched his reaction as he examined each image with the kind of attention that confirmed what she'd already suspected. The words came out clinical, professional. Marcus knew mercenaries when he saw them. The build, the stance, the equipment choices. These weren't street thugs looking for easy targets. These were soldiers for hire, well-funded and well-connected. Victoria's posture shifted slightly, her spine straightening with the careful control of someone fighting not to show vulnerability. She told him about being followed for 3 months. Professional surveillance that her security team had only recently pieced together. Someone had breached her personal security network, accessed files that should have been impossible to reach. At first, her team thought corporate espionage, industrial secrets worth millions. Then they started finding patterns. The same faces at different events, captured in security footage and analyzed through facial recognition software. Cars that appeared too consistently in too many locations. The 3 men Marcus had neutralized last night had conducted reconnaissance at Ashford Industries for weeks, mapping routines and vulnerabilities. Marcus felt his blood run cold. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Victoria met his eyes when she said it. The words landed with the weight of inevitability. Emma had been leverage. Wrong place or right place, depending on whose perspective you adopted. Victoria leaned forward, her expensive perfume clashing with the smell of mildew that permeated their apartment. Her security team had run Marcus's background, dug as deep as their resources allowed. His employment history extended back exactly 7 years, almost to the day he'd walked into Ashford Industries and applied for a janitor position. Before that, nothing. No college records, no prior addresses, no social media presence, no digital footprint of any kind in an age when everyone left traces. Marcus let the silence stretch. The lie he'd lived for 7 years sitting between them like a third presence in the room. Victoria's words hit harder because she didn't make them an accusation. Just an observation delivered with the clinical precision of a CEO analyzing data. Marcus considered his response carefully. The truth would unravel everything he'd built. The lie would leave Emma vulnerable. He settled for something in between, a deflection that acknowledged nothing while admitting everything. Victoria stood and walked to their window, looking out at the street where her motorcade waited like an invasion force. Her reflection in the glass showed someone younger than her years, someone still carrying weight from old trauma. She told him about being 14 and taken. Her voice remained steady, but her hands betrayed her, fingers curling into fists at her sides. 4 days in a basement listening to footsteps overhead, wondering if each sound meant the end. Men arguing about whether killing a senator's daughter would send a stronger message than ransom. Then someone came. Not the police, not the FBI, someone else. Someone who moved through darkness like it was home, who spoke with calm authority even as gunfire echoed somewhere above them, who carried her through miles of forest without ever seeming tired or uncertain. She'd never seen his face clearly. The official rescue team arrived hours later to find her safe with local police, her rescuer already gone like smoke and wind. The trauma specialist her father hired said she'd forget in time. That memory faded and healed and moved on. But she remembered. She remembered strong arms and a voice that promised safety. She remembered believing that promise even when logic said she shouldn't. She remembered feeling protected for the first time in 4 days of absolute terror. So she built an empire, made herself powerful enough that no one could take her again, surrounded herself with security and systems and protocols. Control became her religion. Trust became a luxury she couldn't afford. Until last night when 3 trained operatives walked into her building and a janitor dropped them in 6 seconds. Victoria turned from the window to face Marcus directly. Her offer came wrapped in pragmatism and desperation in equal measure. She needed protection. Her security team could keep her safe in controlled environments, boardrooms and penthouses with armed guards at every entrance. But Marcus had seen a threat and neutralized it instantly, operating on instinct and training that her expensive security consultants couldn't match. Marcus watched Emma, who'd crept closer during the conversation, her curiosity temporarily overwhelming her caution. His daughter who'd already lost her mother. His daughter who deserved a childhood free from violence and fear. Victoria handed him a card. The number would reach her directly, day or night. Or she left with her security detail, the motorcade pulling away 15 minutes later. Neighbors gradually filtered back inside, the excitement over, returning to their normal struggles and small dramas. Emma's question hung in the air between them. Marcus pulled her into a hug, feeling her small heart beating against his chest, her complete trust in his ability to make everything okay pressing down on him like a physical weight. But he knew better. Monsters were very real, and they knew where he lived. At 2 in the morning, Marcus heard it, a faint whir outside their window, barely audible over the ambient noise of the city. He moved to the window in darkness, pressing against the wall and peering out from an angle that wouldn't silhouette him against interior light. The drone hovered 15 feet from their window, small, expensive, equipped with a camera lens that caught street light and glinted like a predator's eye. Military-grade surveillance equipment, the kind that cost 6 figures and required connections to acquire. Someone was watching, someone who wanted him to know they were watching. Marcus grabbed the broom from their tiny kitchen, opened the window in one smooth motion, and threw it like a javelin. The broom handle caught the drone perfectly, sending it spiraling into the alley below. He was down the 4 flights of stairs in seconds, moving with speed that would have surprised anyone who'd only seen him pushing a mop cart. But the alley was empty. The drone was gone. Someone had retrieved it in the 30 seconds it took him to descend. Marcus pulled out Victoria's card and the phone she'd given him along with it, a burner with her number pre-programmed. His text was 2 words. Her response came before he'd even pocketed the phone again. Marcus typed his refusal, each word a decision. Victoria's response carried disbelief and frustration in equal measure. They went back and forth, a conversation conducted in terse sentences and long pauses that said more than the words themselves. Marcus ended it with a statement that left no room for argument. But he knew she was right. Running made you pray. Standing your ground at least gave you a chance to control the field. He went back upstairs but didn't sleep. He watched and thought about Victoria's words. About how running from the past never worked because the past had long legs and good memory. About how some things, once started, had to be finished one way or another. The next afternoon, Marcus stood in the parking lot of Lincoln Elementary, waiting with the other parents and nannies and babysitters. Emma burst through the doors with her backpack bouncing, her voice carrying across the asphalt as she ran toward him. She talked about butterflies the entire walk home, about metamorphosis and chrysalis and how caterpillars basically dissolved into goo before becoming something that could fly. Marcus listened and nodded and scanned their surroundings with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years in hostile territory. Nothing seemed out of place. No cars that shouldn't be there. No faces that triggered recognition. Just a normal pickup at a normal school on a normal Tuesday. But that evening, while Emma did homework at their kitchen table and Marcus attempted to cook spaghetti without burning it for once, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The photo showed Emma that afternoon, taken from across the street with a telephoto lens. The timestamp read 3:05 p.m., exactly when Marcus had been standing next to her. The angle suggested the photographer had been in a vehicle, shooting through a slightly open window. Below the image, a message in plain text. Marcus's hand shook. Not from fear, from rage so pure and cold, it felt like ice water in his veins. They'd photographed his daughter. They'd mentioned Sarah, a woman they couldn't possibly know about unless they dug very deep or had access to classified files that should have been buried with his old identity. He called Victoria's number. She answered on the first ring. Her response came immediate and absolute. Marcus glanced at the clock on their microwave, the green numbers glowing in the dimming light of their apartment. Evening was settling over the city. Victoria's voice carried no room for negotiation. Marcus looked at Emma, innocently drawing butterflies in the margins of her math homework, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. He thought about the photo, about men who would surveil a school, about what came next if he didn't act. He made the call no parent wants to make. Emma looked up at him with those gray eyes so like his own, confused but trusting. She asked no questions, didn't demand explanations. She simply believed that if Daddy said they needed to go somewhere safe, then it was true. That trust felt heavier than any equipment he'd ever carried on any mission. Victoria's office occupied the entire top floor of Ashford Industries Tower. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the city sprawling in all directions, lights beginning to twinkle as dusk surrendered to night. The space was designed to intimidate, all clean lines and minimalist furniture and ruthless efficiency. But when Marcus and Emma arrived at 8:30, escorted by security through a private elevator that required biometric authentication, the office had been transformed. A couch near the windows was made up with pillows and a thick comforter. Hot chocolate waited on a side table, still steaming. Children's books were stacked nearby in a careful arrangement that suggested someone had put real thought into age-appropriate selection. Emma's eyes went wide at the hot chocolate. Victoria knelt to her level, her expensive dress pooling on the floor, her voice gentle in a way that suggested this wasn't a skill she used often. While Emma settled in with her hot chocolate and a picture book, Victoria and Marcus talked in low voices across the room, standing near the windows where the city lights reflected in the glass and made their words feel more private. Victoria pulled up security footage on a tablet. The drone Marcus had destroyed showed up in high resolution, every detail visible. Military grade, autonomous flight capabilities, thermal imaging. The kind of equipment that cost more than most people's annual salary. Her team had traced the three mercenaries through layers of financial obfuscation. Shell companies within shell companies, money flowing through jurisdictions that specialized in opacity. But at the end of that long trail of digital breadcrumbs, they'd found a name. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice water. Victoria watched his face, reading his reaction like text. The name belonged to a fixer. The kind of person powerful people called when problems needed to disappear permanently. Daniel Cross operated in the spaces between legitimate and criminal, arranging things that couldn't be arranged through normal channels. If he was involved, this wasn't about money or business disputes. This was personal. Victoria pressed for details, her CEO instincts demanding information. Marcus hesitated. The truth meant exposing things he'd buried, but the lie meant leaving her vulnerable to something she didn't understand. He started talking, about 20 years ago, about a counterterrorism unit so classified it had no official name. About missions that never made the news because officially they never happened. About extractions and hostage rescue and retrieving people from places that didn't exist on any map. One mission involved a senator's daughter, 14 years old, taken by a criminal organization that specialized in kidnapping for ransom and political leverage. Daniel Cross had been the middleman, negotiating terms and ensuring payment. Marcus's team disrupted the entire operation, pulled the girl out, dismantled the network. Cross lost millions in revenue and every bit of reputation he'd built. The fixer swore revenge against everyone involved. But revenge took planning and resources and patience. Apparently, Cross had spent 20 years accumulating all three. Victoria's face had gone pale during the explanation. Her voice came out barely above a whisper when she asked the question, though some part of her already knew the answer. Marcus confirmed what she'd already guessed. Senator James Ashford, Victoria's father. The silence that followed felt like the moment before thunder, when the air pressure drops and everything goes still. Victoria sat down hard on the nearest chair, her usual poise abandoning her. The words came out raw and unfiltered, shock overriding professional distance. Marcus nodded slowly. The pieces were falling into place for both of them, forming a picture neither wanted to see but couldn't look away from. Victoria's eyes filled with tears she wouldn't let fall. Her voice shook despite her efforts to control it. Decades of searching condensed into a single moment of recognition and grief and something that might have been relief. The memory came back with crystalline clarity, a scared 14-year-old in darkness, a voice promising safety, strong arms that carried her through miles of forest while telling her stories to keep her calm, about constellations and old legends and anything to keep her focused on something other than terror. A promise that her father loved her very much and she'd see him soon. Marcus felt something crack in his chest. He'd forgotten that. Forgotten the stories he'd told to keep a terrified child calm during extraction. Forgotten the way she'd held on to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into chaos. He'd extracted dozens of people over his years in the unit. Never learned names, it was safer that way. For them and for him. When he left, he'd left everything behind, including the faces of people he'd saved. It was the only way to truly disappear. Victoria stood abruptly, walking to the windows. Her reflection ghosted in the glass, city lights painting her silhouette against darkness. Her voice came out hollow, processed through shock and realization. Marcus understood before she finished. Daniel Cross wasn't just after Victoria for her father refusing to pay ransom 20 years ago. He was after Marcus for being part of the team that disrupted his operation. And Emma was leverage against both of them, a way to hurt Senator Ashford and Marcus simultaneously. Revenge delayed was revenge amplified. Cross had spent 2 decades building resources and planning this. The surveillance, the mercenaries, the calculated escalation. This wasn't improvised desperation. This was methodical vengeance. Marcus looked at Emma, who'd fallen asleep on the couch, her stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest, picture book fallen open across her lap. Innocent, unaware. His entire world contained in one small person who trusted him to keep her safe. Victoria turned from the window, her mask reassembling itself piece by piece. But something had changed. The distance between CEO and janitor had collapsed under the weight of shared history and present danger. The alliance formed in that moment felt inevitable, like recognizing something that had always been true but required the right circumstances to become visible. Marcus stayed silent for a long time, weighing options that all felt inadequate. Finally, he nodded, setting conditions that were non-negotiable. Victoria smiled for the first time since arriving at his apartment that morning. It transformed her face, made her look younger and less burdened. The next 72 hours moved with controlled urgency. Victoria's security team swept the building floor by floor, installing additional cameras and motion sensors. They found two more surveillance devices, tiny and sophisticated, hidden in places that suggested inside knowledge. One in a conference room, another in a server closet. The discovery led to deeper investigation. Two inside connections emerged. A maintenance worker installed 6 months ago with credentials that looked legitimate until examined closely. A mid-level executive turned through blackmail, gambling debts carefully leveraged by someone patient and thorough. Both were arrested quietly, federal charges pending. Victoria watched the interrogations through one-way glass, her expression cold and controlled. Marcus reviewed building schematics, pointing out details Victoria's expensive security consultants had missed, camera blind spots, service corridors that didn't appear on official layouts, evacuation routes that could become infiltration routes with the right knowledge. 7 years of pushing a mop cart through these hallways had given him an education no amount of security training could replicate. Victoria found herself impressed despite the circumstances. Marcus saw the building differently, understanding its vulnerabilities through the lens of someone who'd spent years making himself invisible within its architecture. Emma stayed in Victoria's office during the day, watched by Victoria's assistant, Jennifer, a woman in her 40s with 3 nieces and an apparently endless supply of patience. Emma drew pictures and read books and asked Victoria questions during the brief moments when the CEO wasn't buried in conference calls and crisis management. The tentative friendship that formed between them felt natural, despite the artificial circumstances of its creation. Emma showed Victoria her drawings, all of which featured Marcus as some kind of superhero, cape optional, but abs prominently displayed. Victoria laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuineness. Emma talked about her father with the unfiltered adoration of a 7-year-old who'd never had reason to doubt that her parent could fix anything. Something softened in Victoria during these moments. The armor she'd built over 20 years developed cracks, letting light through. On the third day, Marcus noticed something that Victoria's security team had missed. He found Victoria in her office reviewing overnight reports, Emma coloring quietly in the corner. His voice carried certainty that demanded attention. Victoria looked up from her screen, reading the concern in his posture. Marcus explained his reasoning. Whoever orchestrated this level of operation needed more than maintenance workers and blackmailed executives. They needed someone with access to Victoria's personal schedule, her security protocols, the kind of high-level information that lived above the usual organizational chart. Before Victoria could respond, Richard Hayes entered, head of security, 45 years old, with the company for 8 years. Victoria trusted him completely, had promoted him twice, relied on his judgment for every security decision. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it with the casual reflex of someone checking constant messages, then turned slightly away as he read, a micro gesture of concealment that most people wouldn't notice. But Marcus noticed. He saw the text reflected in the window behind Hayes, 3 words that confirmed every suspicion. Marcus moved with speed that surprised everyone. He crossed the distance before Hayes could react, disarming him with practiced efficiency, phone clattering to the expensive carpet. Victoria's shock registered on her face, frozen between comprehension and denial. Marcus retrieved the phone, navigating to messages without needing a password since the device was still unlocked. The conversation filled the screen. Blueprints, security protocols, Victoria's schedule for the past 3 months, all sent to a number registered to a burner phone. And from that number, messages that made everything clear. Hayes didn't fight, didn't run. He stood with the posture of a man who'd been waiting for this moment, dreading it, but knowing it was inevitable. Victoria's voice carried betrayal sharper than any anger. Hayes met her eyes finally, and what she saw there wasn't malice. It was desperation and guilt, and the kind of exhaustion that came from impossible choices. The confession spilled out, words tumbling over each other. Cross had his daughter, taken 3 weeks ago, held in an undisclosed location. If Hayes didn't help, she died. Simple as that. Every piece of information he provided bought another day of his daughter's life. Victoria started to respond with fury, but Marcus's question cut through with tactical precision. Hayes looked at Emma, saw the parallel clearly. A man would do anything for his child. The boundaries between right and wrong dissolved when measured against that kind of love and fear. The timeline felt compressed, urgency wrapped around every hour. Cross was coming tonight, midnight. He wanted to finish this before Victoria could run, before federal resources could mobilize properly, before the advantage shifted. Emma had been coloring near the window, out of the direct conversation but close enough to hear fragments. Her small voice cut through the adult tension. Marcus knelt to her level, taking her hands in his. The promise felt heavy, weighted with responsibility he couldn't guarantee but wouldn't refuse. The evening moved with calculated preparation. Victoria evacuated the building except for essential security. Marcus transformed the office into something defensible. Not a fortress, but better than nothing. Emma was secured in the panic room, a reinforced space hidden behind a bookshelf that doubled as a door. Victoria gave Emma her personal phone, the emergency function pre-programmed. One button press and police, FBI, every resource would descend on this location. Emma nodded seriously, understanding the weight of responsibility. Marcus and Victoria stood at the windows watching the city transition from dusk to full darkness. Below them, 42 floors down, traffic flowed and people moved through their normal lives, unaware that something dangerous was converging on this building. Victoria's voice came out smaller than usual, stripped of corporate authority. Just a woman admitting fear. Marcus understood. Fear kept you alert. Complacency killed. Victoria talked about that basement 20 years ago, about being 14 and helpless and swearing she'd never feel that way again, about building an empire as armor against vulnerability. Marcus's response carried the weight of experience. Victoria looked at him, really looked, and saw past the janitor's uniform he no longer wore to the man underneath. Neither of them were alone anymore. That changed everything. The calm before midnight felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. Emma slept in the panic room, monitored by camera. Marcus checked his improvised weapons. Fire extinguisher, chair legs, anything heavy or blunt. He knew these tools better than guns anyway. Close quarters combat where you used environment and leverage instead of firepower. Victoria sat at her computer, fingers flying across keyboard. She contacted her father. FBI was en route, but 15 minutes away minimum, probably longer with traffic and coordination. They were alone until then. Marcus's job was simple in concept, brutally difficult in execution. Buy time, keep Cross away from Emma and Victoria until help arrived. Everything else was details. At 11:30, the building's emergency systems went dark. Not triggered, silenced. The alarms that should have screamed stayed quiet. The lights that should have blazed red remained off. Victoria's fingers flew across her keyboard, attempting to regain control of systems that had been hijacked with sophistication that spoke of extensive planning. Marcus grabbed the fire extinguisher, testing its weight, heavy enough to do damage, accessible without special training, effective in close quarters. Victoria's question carried multiple layers: where he was going, what he was planning, whether she'd see him again. Marcus's answer was tactical and terrible. Victoria grabbed his arm before he could leave, her grip surprisingly strong. The moments stretched between them, connection forming from crisis and shared history and something that might become more if they survived. Marcus moved into the darkened corridors, emergency lights casting everything in shades of red and shadow. He could hear them. Multiple teams. Well-coordinated, professional movement that created almost no sound, but wasn't quite silent to ears trained to listen. He counted at least 8 hostiles, probably more. The smart play was hiding, waiting for police, letting professionals handle professionals. But police took time. Emma didn't have time. Victoria didn't have time. So Marcus became what he'd promised himself he'd never be again. He became Ghost. He became the weapon he'd tried to bury for 7 years. He became whatever was necessary to protect the 2 people in this building who mattered more than breath itself. The hunt began. 3 weeks after the surgery, Marcus stood in their apartment kitchen attempting to flip pancakes without setting off the smoke detector. His right arm moved stiffly where flying glass from the shattered window had shredded muscle tissue alongside the bullet's entry wound. Physical therapy was slowly restoring what that night had stolen, though the therapist warned full recovery would take 6 months minimum. Emma sat at the table with homework spread before her, chewing on a pencil eraser with the concentration of someone solving complex equations rather than third-grade addition. She'd started seeing Dr. Patricia Chen twice weekly, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. The sessions helped, though Emma still woke from nightmares occasionally, still reached for Marcus's hand when crowds got too dense or buildings felt too tall. Victoria arrived at 7:30 most mornings now, using the key Marcus had given her the second week. She brought coffee from the place 3 blocks over that Emma insisted made it taste like happiness. Though Marcus suspected the sugar and whipped cream played larger roles than bean selection, Victoria wore jeans on weekends, her hair down instead of controlled into corporate severity, looking younger and less defended. The casual intimacy of these mornings felt revolutionary. Victoria helping Emma with homework, while Marcus burnt breakfast. The three of them eating together at a table that didn't wobble. Normal routines building on each other like layers of sediment, creating foundation from accumulated moments. 6 months after his first paycheck as head of security, they'd outgrown the 15th floor apartment. The decision to buy a house came naturally. Marcus's salary increase, combined with Victoria's resources, made it possible. 3 bedrooms in a neighborhood where Emma could bike safely and yards existed for playing. The move happened during Emma's summer break, her excitement about having her own room eclipsing any nostalgia for the apartment that had represented their first taste of stability. They'd painted Emma's walls herself, chosen purple, assembled furniture that came in impossible flat-pack configurations, planted flowers in a garden that belonged to them rather than a landlord who never fixed anything. Marcus's first day as head of security came with suits that fit properly in an office on the 35th floor. The security team greeted him with professional courtesy, masking curiosity about the janitor who'd become their boss through violence and circumstance. Some resented the promotion. Others remembered footage of him taking down 8 mercenaries while wounded and decided questions about qualifications were irrelevant. He spent the first week reviewing every protocol, finding gaps that expensive consultants had missed because they'd never actually had to fight through a building under assault. His recommendations came with the authority of experience rather than theory. When he suggested changes, people listened because everyone had heard what happened on the 42nd floor, even if official reports remained sealed. Victoria stopped by his office most afternoons with questions that could have been emails but served as excuses for conversation. They talked about security upgrades and Emma's adjustment to having structure and whether the scar on his chest still hurt when weather changed. Professional boundaries blurred into personal ones until the distinction felt meaningless. Emma thrived with stability. Her teacher called to report improved focus and increased participation. She'd made friends, real ones who came over for play dates that involved giggling and elaborate games with rules only 7-year-olds understood. She talked about her father less like a superhero and more like a person, which Marcus took as evidence of healing. But she'd also started calling Victoria by name without the misprefix, and sometimes forgot to specify whether she meant mommy in heaven or Victoria when talking about her mother. The conflation worried Marcus until Dr. Chen explained it was healthy, that children had infinite capacity for love, and adding people didn't diminish existing bonds. 3 months became rhythm. Marcus worked days, came home by 6, cooked dinners that gradually improved from inedible to merely bad. Victoria joined them most evenings, sometimes bringing takeout that saved everyone from Marcus's cooking, sometimes just showing up because her penthouse felt too empty and their house felt like where she belonged. They hadn't defined what they were. Hadn't kissed beyond the almost moment on the balcony that first night in the apartment. But Emma's casual comments about when Victoria would move in and whether the wedding would have chocolate cakes suggested the 7-year-old had fewer questions about their status than the adults did. But some nights Marcus still woke gasping, phantom bullets tearing through his chest, Emma's scream echoing in dreams that refused to acknowledge safety. His hands would reach for weapons that weren't there, muscle memory expecting fire extinguishers or improvised tools, finding only bed sheets and darkness. The house would feel like a trap rather than sanctuary, every shadow hiding mercenaries who'd been dead for months. Victoria learned to recognize the signs before he fully woke, his breathing changing, muscles tensing even in sleep, small sounds escaping his throat that weren't quite words. She'd wake him gently, anchor him back to present with touch and whispered reminders that they were home, they were safe, the monsters were gone. Her hands on his face, solid and warm, more effective than any medication. Dr. Patricia Chen, who saw Marcus monthly in addition to Emma's twice-weekly sessions, said it was normal. Trauma didn't evaporate because circumstances improved. Healing was nonlinear, circling back on itself before moving forward again. The brain needed time to rewire pathways carved by crisis, to learn that hypervigilance was no longer required for survival. Marcus attended therapy with the same discipline he'd once brought to training, learning to coexist with memories that wouldn't fully leave, but could be managed, integrated, transformed from poison into something closer to scar tissue, permanent but no longer actively bleeding. He practiced grounding techniques, acknowledged triggers, gave himself permission to struggle without interpreting struggle as failure. Emma noticed the nightmares even when he tried to hide them. She'd crawl into bed between him and Victoria on bad mornings, her small warmth a reminder of what he'd fought for and why staying present mattered more than dwelling in past violence. She'd pat his face with her small hands and announce that bad dreams were just brain hiccups, nothing to worry about. They'd go away eventually. Her matter-of-fact acceptance helped more than she could know. Children possess the ability to acknowledge pain without being consumed by it, to witness adults struggle without losing faith in adult competence. Emma saw her father's nightmares and loved him anyway, completely, without reservation or judgment. Victoria's presence transformed those dark hours from isolation into shared burden. She didn't try to fix him or rush his healing or pretend the trauma hadn't happened. She simply stayed, made coffee at 3 in the morning without complaint, listened when he needed to talk, and sat in silence when words felt impossible. Her steadiness became the foundation he rebuilt himself on, proof that he didn't have to carry everything alone. 6 months after the tower, spring arrived with determination. Central Park transformed into green and flowering chaos, winter's death giving way to aggressive life. Marcus took Emma there on Saturday morning, Victoria meeting them with a picnic basket she'd assembled with more enthusiasm than skill. The sandwiches were asymmetrical and overstuffed, but Emma declared them perfect because Victoria made them, which settled the matter conclusively. They spread a blanket on grass, still slightly damp from morning dew. Emma ran off to join a frisbee game with kids she'd never met, her natural reserve finally breaking under the accumulated weight of feeling safe. Marcus and Victoria watched her, shoulders touching, comfortable with silence that required no filling. Marcus's admission came quietly, almost lost under park noise and distant traffic. Victoria turned to look at him, reading the vulnerability in his posture. His gesture encompassed Emma laughing with strangers, the park alive with people enjoying ordinary Saturday freedom, the simple miracle of breathing without pain and sleeping without nightmares most nights. Peace felt like such an inadequate word for what he meant. It couldn't capture the weight of not waiting for the other shoe to drop, not scanning crowds for threats, not planning escape routes from playgrounds. Victoria's response carried certainty he was still building toward. She saw his doubt clearly, read it in the tension he carried despite safety and stability, and 6 months of evidence that maybe, possibly, this could last. Her fingers laced through his, concrete proof of presence and intention. Marcus squeezed back, holding on to something he was slowly learning to believe might be permanent. Emma returned breathless and grass-stained, collapsing between them with theatrical exhaustion. She demanded sandwiches and water and attention in the way children do when happiness makes them expansive. Victoria unpacked food while Emma narrated her frisbee triumph with embellishments that turned a casual game into epic competition. Between bites of sandwich, Emma's question emerged with the calculated casualness of someone who'd been building courage. Marcus froze mid-chew. Victoria carefully set down her water bottle. Emma watched them both with eyes that missed nothing, waiting for confirmation of what she already suspected. The silence stretched just long enough for Emma to worry she'd overstepped. Then Victoria laughed, genuine and delighted, tension breaking into possibility. Emma's insistence carried the absolute certainty of someone who'd already planned the entire event in her head. Marcus looked at Victoria, seeing his own surprise and hope reflected back. This wasn't how he'd imagined this conversation, but nothing about their relationship had followed conventional patterns. Why should this? Emma produced a ring from her pocket with the flourish of a magician, revealing the trick's finale. Pink plastic from a vending machine outside the grocery store, probably cost 50 cents, utterly ridiculous and somehow perfect. She handed it to Marcus with the expectation of immediate use. Marcus shook his head, smiling despite himself. But his hand went to his other pocket, fingers finding the small box he'd carried for 2 weeks while trying to plan the perfect moment. Apparently, Emma had decided the perfect moment was now, and maybe she was right. Maybe perfect was just wherever they were together. He pulled out the real ring, simple and elegant, chosen with Victoria's assistant's covert help. Emma gasped with the satisfaction of being proven right about adult feelings, her grin spreading wide enough to hurt. Marcus opened the box, the ring catching sunlight and throwing tiny rainbows across blanket fabric. His proposal came without rehearsed speeches or elaborate declarations, just truth delivered simply because complexity would have diminished it. Victoria's tears arrived before words did, streaming down her face while she nodded, reaching for him and the ring, and the future all at once. Marcus slid it onto her finger, perfect fit because he'd paid attention during those weekend mornings when she gestured with coffee cups and her hands caught light. Emma cheered loud enough to attract attention from nearby picnickers, who saw the ring and the tears and added their applause to hers. Strangers celebrating love between people they'd never met, because joy was contagious and the world needed more of it. They kissed finally, properly, without daughters or emergencies or uncertainty making them hesitate. It tasted like possibility and coffee and the particular sweetness of choosing each other deliberately. With full knowledge of what that meant, Emma wedged herself between them, demanding inclusion in the embrace, her skinny arms barely reaching around both adults. They folded her in, complete in ways that transcended biology or law. Family assembled from crisis and choice and the stubborn insistence that love could be built even when circumstances suggested otherwise. Planning the wedding took 3 months of negotiations between Victoria's corporate efficiency and Marcus's preference for simplicity. They compromised on small ceremony at Senator Ashford's estate garden, 50 guests maximum. Emma's approval required for all major decisions. She took her role seriously, vetoing flower arrangements and approving caterers with the gravity of someone conducting international diplomacy. The day arrived with perfect weather, as if nature itself had agreed to cooperate. Emma wore white with more enthusiasm than grace, her flower girl duties performed with solemn concentration that lasted until she saw the bubble machine and abandoned protocol entirely. Nobody minded. Weddings were supposed to have joy, and Emma embodied that completely. Senator Ashford walked Victoria down an aisle of roses and garden lights as sunset painted everything gold. His whisper carried only to Victoria, words meant for daughter ears alone. She squeezed his arm, her own whispered response making him smile with paternal satisfaction. Marcus waited at the improvised altar, suit fitting better than any uniform ever had, hands steady despite the enormity of what was about to happen. When Victoria appeared, everything else dissolved into periphery. Just her, moving toward him with certainty in every step, no hesitation or doubt marring the moment. The ceremony itself blurred into sensory impressions rather than distinct memories. Victoria's hand in his, solid and real. The officiant's words washing over them like blessing. Emma standing beside them, rabbit clutched tight, witnessing the formalization of what she'd already claimed as fact. The vows came when Marcus spoke them, words he'd written at 3 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come and his heart insisted on articulation. He promised presence and consistency, to come home every night and be there for breakfast every morning, to never miss the important moments because work demanded sacrifice. He promised to be the father Emma deserved and the husband Victoria had chosen, to build a life worth protecting and protect it with everything he had. Victoria's vows answered with her own promises, crafted with the precision she brought to everything important. She vowed to love Emma as her own, to build a life with Marcus that honored both the past and the future, to never let fear or old trauma prevent her from showing up completely. She promised to be partner and wife and mother, to defend their family with all the resources she commanded and the love she'd learned to trust again. The rings exchanged were simple bands, hers with small diamonds, his unadorned metal. Emma presented them on a pillow with such careful solemnity that multiple guests reached for tissues. The symbolism of circles without end, promises made tangible, felt heavier than the actual weight of gold. When the officiant pronounced them married, Emma cheered before they could kiss, destroying any pretense of dignified ceremony. They laughed and kissed anyway, while Emma danced between them and guests applauded, and the future opened before them like a door they'd been standing in front of without realizing they could walk through. The reception involved dancing and cake and toasts that ranged from touching to embarrassing. Senator Ashford spoke about finding Marcus again after 20 years, about the strange paths that led people to where they needed to be, about the satisfaction of seeing his daughter truly happy for the first time since childhood. His voice broke slightly when he welcomed Marcus and Emma to the family officially, no longer just the people who'd been present for crisis but chosen members of their small clan. Marcus danced with Victoria to music he didn't recognize, moving with adequate competence learned specifically for this occasion. She fit against him perfectly, her head on his shoulder, both of them swaying more than actually dancing, but nobody seemed to care about technical proficiency. The honest question from her lips made him hold her closer. He thought about Sarah, about promises made in hospital rooms and broken by biology, about 7 years of survival and the slow rebuilding that had happened when he stopped running from the past and started building towards something different. About Emma, asleep in Victoria's arms during those first terrifying nights in the tower. About bulletproof glass cracking and fire escapes and choosing to hold on even when letting go would have been easier. His answer carried absolute certainty, no hesitation or qualification required. Victoria's smile against his shoulder confirmed she'd needed to hear it as much as he'd needed to say it. Later, when most guests had departed and Emma had crashed hard from sugar and excitement, Marcus found himself alone with his daughter. She'd changed from flower girl white into pajamas, rabbit restored to proper place tucked under her arm. They sat together on garden steps, watching caterers clean up the debris of celebration. Emma's question came softly, tentative in ways she rarely was anymore. Marcus's throat tightened with emotion he didn't bother hiding. He painted the picture with words, making Sarah real for Emma in ways photographs couldn't quite capture. Her mother would have loved this day, loved Victoria for the strength and kindness she brought, loved seeing Emma so happy and secure. She would have approved of everything, from the bubble machine to the questionable jokes in the best man's speech, to the way Victoria looked at both of them like they were the answer to questions she'd spent 20 years asking. Emma considered this seriously, processing what the gravity children bring to understanding the dead. Marcus kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of whatever fruity shampoo Victoria had bought, feeling the solid reality of his daughter alive and safe, and his. The past and present didn't have to be at war. They could coexist, informing each other, making the present richer for acknowledging what came before. They sat together until Victoria found them, changed from her wedding dress into comfortable clothes, ready to begin the next phase. She sat on Marcus's other side, Emma immediately leaning across to rest against her too, creating a small chain of contact that felt like the physical manifestation of commitment. 1 year folded into routine so complete that the crisis preceding it felt increasingly distant. Marcus woke before alarm, habit from years of early shifts impossible to break. The house they'd bought together sat in a neighborhood with good schools and yards where kids played without fear. Emma's room had evolved from empty space into personality shrine, walls covered with drawings and posters and the accumulated debris of childhood interests that shifted weekly. Sunday mornings meant pancakes that no longer burnt. Marcus had finally mastered the technique, though Emma insisted the slightly burnt ones from early attempts tasted better because they came with more love. She was 9 now, starting to show signs of the person she'd become, less little girl and more individual with opinions and preferences that didn't always align with adult wisdom. She worked on homework at the kitchen table, tongue poking out in concentration that reminded Marcus painfully of Sarah. The resemblance grew stronger as Emma aged, features settling into arrangements that echoed her mother. But her personality was purely her own, constructed from genetics and environment in the particular alchemy that made people distinct. Victoria read news on her tablet, feet tucked under her, comfortable in ways the polished CEO would have found impossible. She'd learned to exist in 2 modes, the professional armor donned for boardrooms and the casual openness reserved for home. The transition between them had become seamless, instant code switching that honored both versions without requiring one to eliminate the other. Emma's announcement came with the controlled excitement of someone trying to seem casual about something deeply important. Marcus flipped a pancake, watching it rise and fall with the same satisfaction that never quite faded no matter how many times the technique proved successful. His pride settled warm in his chest, genuine and uncomplicated. Emma had inherited intelligence from both parents, but her way of seeing the world was uniquely hers. The janitor superhero story had been her favorite project all year, revised and polished until the handwritten pages showed wear from constant handling. Victoria set down her tablet, giving Emma full attention because important things deserve that. The contest represented validation from outside their family circle, proof that Emma's talent existed independent of parental bias. Emma's grin could have powered cities. She launched into explaining the contest rules and categories and what winning might mean with the enthusiasm of someone for whom possibility hadn't yet been constrained by probability. Marcus listened and encouraged and felt grateful that his daughter still believed good things could happen simply because she wanted them to. Victoria's voice carried a strange quality, tighter than usual, as if controlling something beneath the words. Marcus glanced over, seeing tension in her shoulders despite the casual pose. She met his eyes, her expression shifting into nervousness and excitement and fear all compressed together. The pause stretched. Emma looked up from her homework, attention drawn by the change in atmosphere adults created when something significant was about to happen. Marcus abandoned the pancakes, turning fully toward Victoria, reading the truth in her face before she spoke it. The words landed like a gift wrapped in responsibility and hope. Marcus's hands went slack, spatula clattering into the sink. Forgotten. Emma's scream could probably be heard in the next county, pure joy unfiltered by any adult restraint. The question burst from Emma as she launched herself at Victoria, wrapping around her with the total commitment of children when emotions overwhelmed structure. Victoria laughed and cried simultaneously, hormones and happiness creating feedback loops that made emotional regulation impossible. Marcus crossed the kitchen, folding both of them into embrace, his mind racing through implications while his heart simply expanded to accommodate this new dimension of responsibility and love. Another child, Emma's sibling, their family growing beyond the boundaries they'd established. The kiss carried gratitude and love, and the particular terror of bringing new life into a world that had proven itself dangerous. But also the hope that came from building something strong enough to protect that vulnerability, from creating a space where children could grow without the weight of their parents' trauma pressing down on them. Emma's practical question broke the moment, dragging them back from emotional overwhelm into the concrete realities of siblinghood, the logistics of shared spaces and divided attention, and the restructuring required when one became two. Victoria's answer came gentle but firm, acknowledging Emma's importance in this process, making her part of the decision-making that would shape their family's next evolution. Emma nodded seriously, already planning room arrangements and toy distribution with the organizational skills she'd inherited from Victoria. 9 months stretched ahead, time to prepare for the next transformation. Marcus thought about diapers and sleepless nights, about watching another person become themselves in increments too small to measure day by day, about Emma becoming a sister, Victoria becoming a mother to an infant rather than a 7-year-old who arrived already formed. They stood together in the kitchen, Emma wedged between them with her arms around both, already talking to the baby that was still just cells dividing and multiplying with purposeful intent. The future opened before them, uncertain in its details but clear in its direction. Marcus had been many things over the course of his life. The operator with clearance higher than most senators, moving through darkness to extract hostages from places that didn't exist on official maps. The ghost who eliminated threats with precision that left no trace and no questions. The janitor who'd hidden from his past while raising his daughter alone, surviving on minimum wage and maximum determination. The husband who'd learned to trust that good things could be permanent if you protected them carefully enough. The father who discovered that love expanded infinitely, that adding people didn't divide attention but multiplied capacity. But beneath all those roles existed something simpler. Just Marcus. Just a man who'd learned that strength wasn't about surviving alone, but about building something worth coming home to. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving toward what mattered, despite terror trying to freeze you in place. Not a weapon, not a ghost, not defined by violence or trauma or the worst moments of his past. Just a person who'd chosen to love and be loved, to trust and be trusted, to show up every day and do the work of building something that would outlast crisis. His family, his home, his life, earned through crisis and built through choice. Not perfect, because perfection was myth, but real, solid, worth protecting with everything he had. Sarah would have been proud. Victoria was magnificent. Emma would be an incredible sister. And the child growing inside Victoria carried the promise of all the tomorrows Marcus had stopped believing in 7 years ago, when loss felt like the only constant. He looked at his wife and daughter, both of them glowing with excitement and hope, planning nursery colors and baby names with the kind of joy that came from safety, hard-won. The morning light painted them in gold, ordinary and miraculous in equal measure. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Marcus Sullivan felt something settle in his chest that might have been peace. Not the absence of struggle or the guarantee of safety, but the certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything.